Good evening, a warm welcome to everybody. Thanks very much for joining us here at the Economic Research Council for this really compelling discussion on complex indebtedness. We're delighted to have you here with us as we explore really critical issues really surrounding historical injustice, global inequality, and international relations. It's a real honor to have our esteemed speaker, Dr. Meera Sabaratnam, who is the Associate Professor in International Relations at the University of Oxford. Meera specializes in critical and post-colonial international relations, focusing on global injustice, decolonization, and the legacies of imperialism. Some of her research critically examines the contemporary international order and its underlying power structures, and most recently through this groundbreaking concept we'll hear about today of complex indebtedness. She's widely published, and her work addresses how historical forms of exploitation and inequality shape current global politics and economic relations. The form that this session will take is that Meera will deliver a 30-minute presentation, as we usually have, and after that we'll have an interactive question and answer session. So as the talk is going by, please do feel free to post any questions that you have into the Q&A section, and we'll collect those at the end. Okay, without any further ado then, it's my pleasure to hand over to Dr. Meera Sabaratnam to share her valuable insights. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I'm going to just share my screen with you, and I hope you can all see that. David, is that all good?
Yeah, that's all
Great.
good.
Okay. Well, first, a big thank you to David and to the Economic Research Council for hosting me. I think the work of the ERC is really important in terms of improving sort of public understanding of economics and hosting economic debates that fall not just within kind of current policy concerns, but which push the frontiers of what people are talking about. And I think that's really important for the health of any modern democracy for reasons that I think will become clear. So again, thanks very much for the invitation. Now, it won't have escaped your notice that I am not an economist by training. I'm a political scientist specialized in international relations, and I take that to include the organization and distribution of power and authority in the world. And of course, that includes questions about how we allocate resources and what kinds of values or laws or rules underpin the allocation of resources. So for the purposes of today's talk, I'm taking a sort of cross-disciplinary approach to the question of the economy, embedded as much in politics and anthropology and sociology as in kind of conventional economics. And so without much further ado, I'm going to introduce you to this idea of complex indebtedness. Now, this is a term that I came up with almost as a sort of thought by accident when I was reading some of the debt literature after the 2008 global financial crisis. And it was in response to the idea of complex interdependence, which we know very well, which for decades has been our main way of thinking about globalization. But the ubiquity of debt and the power of debt in the global economy and all the kind of attendant political issues seem to me to warrant a closer focus on indebtedness. So what I'd like to do today is in a fairly kind of crude and simplified way, walk you through what it might mean to understand the world order as constituted by and through complex indebtedness, and then to think about the political and economic questions, I suppose, that it raises as a result. Okay. So I will get started. Just to give you an outline of what I'm going to be talking about, I'm first going to look at the role of indebtedness in the making of modern sovereign states. So we're going a bit historical with this question. And then I'm also going to look at the question with regard to the empires that were attached to those modern sovereign states and how they worked through imperial debt formations. We'll then zoom forward a little bit and think about the financialization of the world economy, and particularly think about the changes that have happened since the 1970s. And finally, we'll look at some of the ways in which the language or the idea of indebtedness has been mobilized to pursue alternative, let's say, political accounts or balance sheets of who owes what to whom. And finally, we'll talk through what I think some of the implications of thinking about the world through the lens of complex indebtedness are. And I look forward very much to your questions, comments, queries in how I'm approaching this and in terms of what it might mean. Okay, so let's press on. So first of all, what is debt or what is indebtedness? For the purpose of my talk or my argument, I'm understanding it as the broad condition of being required to yield resource or service or gratitude over time to some other party. Now, following the sort of David Graeber construction of this in a general sense, this is part of all societies across all times. What it means to cooperate in any social order means to kind of pool resources to a certain extent or to make promises that are binding in some kinds of ways to other members in your group. So in that sense, it's not particularly unusual as a condition. In fact, some people would go so far as to say it's the very basis of sociality itself, right? The ability to kind of generate obligations to each other that are binding. In terms of the Western origins of the term, there's quite a lot of interesting, almost theological work on this, which look at its relationship to sin and guilt in the biblical tradition, and the idea that actually sins and guilts and debts are bound together in certain formulations, particularly Germanic formulations, but also the Hebrew formulations in the Lord's Prayer, that you're being forgiven your debts really as much, and then that's translated later into sins or trespasses. But that relationship of debt and guilt has had a long history in the West and in its understanding of the, if you like, morally difficult nature of an indebted person. Now, debt is necessarily a non-reciprocal relationship. Yes, you could be mutually indebted to each other, but in most cases, there's a debtor and a creditor. And that's quite important because it's asymmetric in that sense. You have a form of power that's generated through the relationship that is, at least at a particular time, one way. And that's important in terms of thinking about how it organizes power within society. Now, I appreciate this is all quite abstract. We'll kind of get to more concrete definitions of it at the moment. But in general, debtors and creditors have power that is distributed between them. But then thinking more broadly about how it relates to the modern economic order, for someone like Richard Dienst, who's written about this from a sort of philosophical standpoint, we can think about debt as ultimately representing the difference between what you need at some point and what you have. Now, economists are very used to understanding a sort of resource or wages life cycle, where at the beginning of your life, you don't earn anything, but you sort of demand a lot of resource through your life. You earn things, and the amount of resource, hopefully, that you generate is more than you need. And then towards the end of your life, it goes the other way. But for Dienst, that's a generalized kind of social condition. There are always people with less than they need at a particular time and people with sort of surpluses. And all of those relationships of uneven access to resources or across time can be captured through this idea of debt, or can be sort of organized through relations of debt. So that gives us a sort of kind of philosophical understanding of what debt is. Now, of course, in an economic sense, we think about those debts as the ones which are monetized, right? So those ones which have a contractual amount, which are denominated in a form of money, which maybe have an interest rate and a repayment date and all the rest of it. But in a sociological sense, debts can be all sorts of things which may not be monetized as well. So, okay, what's my first argument? My first argument is that when we think about the creation of the modern state, which is the sort of starting point for a lot of modern social sciences, that the organization of indebtedness is absolutely central to thinking about what the modern sovereign state is and what it can do. Let's go first then to thinking a little bit about what we mean by a modern sovereign state. And this will be a rehearsal, if any of you have done sort of undergraduate politics on how we define modern sovereign states. So Weber said that the state was a political organization that exercised a monopoly over the legitimate use of violence or force within a given territory. So a state is a particular kind of organization that works through legitimate authority and the exclusion of other kinds of force. And we think of modern states as being very good, very effective, because they've got bureaucracies which are rule governed and rational, broadly speaking, in their operations. We understand them as supporting or being supported by a capitalist political economy, organized through freedom of the market, liberalization, and so on. And we also understand the modern state as one which is disenchanted with religion, so has essentially secularized itself for the purposes of governance. And so these characteristics are kind of central to how we understand what could be modern about a modern state. What about sovereign states? When we talk about sovereignty, what we talk about is the fact of internal control, so effective sovereignty over your territory, and external recognition, so that you are recognized as a sovereign by others. So to put it all very crudely, a modern sovereign state can do stuff. It does stuff sort of through bureaucratic rule in a secular capitalist kind of way, and it exercises full control over its internal affairs and is recognized as such externally. So how does this emerge? Now, the normal story we tell about how they emerge is through a relationship, well, firstly in a sort of historical geographic space that is in Europe in the middle of the last millennium. We think of modern states as emerging from the sort of late 16th, early 17th century onwards, and becoming crafted and consolidated through particularly the 19th century. And how do they do this? I mean, one of the crude and kind of widespread, it's not crude, it is widespread assumptions about how states emerge is through war making, right? So war made the state and the state made war, Charles Tilly's kind of famous dictum. And so in this logic, what wars do is they force the state to centralize resources in order to fight the wars. So you tax people, you get manpower, and you conscript people if you need to, and then you fight the wars, and then you have this kind of strong legacy organization that can either force others to merge with it or take over other spaces. And through the years, you get these states that, because they fight wars and they fight them against each other, they can then do a lot of other stuff as a result. What does this story miss? So what I would say this story misses is a story about the role of debt and indebtedness in all of this, in all of these processes. So this brings us to the question of the invention of the national debt. We assume that the national debt might be something that has always existed, but in fact, this is not the case, that prior to the invention of the national debt, kings were essentially had to borrow money or fund wars on their own, right? They would borrow, they would expropriate from their lords and barons, they'd force various forms of tribute to be made, but they were ultimately on the hook for the national debt. Now, for various reasons in the 17th century, civil war, royal profligacy, and the ultimate need of to bring the sort of the crown under parliamentary control, the Bank of England was created in 1694 in order to also meet a specific need, which was another war under William and Mary. And so the Bank of England was created, and in, if you like, in exchange for lending the crown some money, the merchants who got together with all their capital were able to incorporate themselves formally as a bank. Now, this was really important to fund the war that was going on and to formally stabilize the regime financing going forward. Now, what does this do? This makes it finally a public debt. Everybody is now collectively on the hook, essentially forever, for the repayments. So it's not really the Crown's debts anymore, it's really England's debts, and very soon afterwards it will become kind of Scotland as well. Scotland, by the way, joins the Union, of course, in part because it's so indebted and can't afford to pay its bills. So this public debt now means that everybody's now collectively on the hook forever for the repayments. And you can see, for example, that George Osborne is still paying off some of our Napoleonic war bonds, some of our bonds that were contracted hundreds of years ago, still not paid off. But this massively expands the reach and the capacity of states. So all of that stuff that states can do now, they can do it because they've got a permanent source of income. They can borrow against the expectation of being able to repay it. And then they can mobilize taxation, and increasingly taxation going forward, in order to repay the debt. So the state, the Crown, goes from becoming, if you like, an individual credit risk to a collective insurance scheme for the repayment of state debt. And this is a massively important financial innovation, and one that particularly benefits England in the wars to come. So this is a graph from the Office of Budget Responsibility, showing you the national debt since essentially the establishment of the Bank of England. And what you see very clearly from the graph is, of course, the expansion of debts during times of war and their gradual decreases afterwards. You'll see, of course, the historically massive debts up to after the end of the Napoleonic Wars and after World War II. What else is going on at this time? The other important thing, and this speaks back to Weber's idea about the disenchantment of the state, is that usury laws are effectively abolished. So usury was considered immoral in the Abrahamic religions. There were all sorts of biblical references to how you mustn't charge interest or enrich yourself on a loan. But this is kind of gradually weakened, and there's all sorts of obviously violations of this in the economic sphere. But in a formal sense, the real pressure kind of grows during that period of competitive state making that Tilly talks about. And so Henry V in England first lifts some of these restrictions on usury, and they're eventually abolished altogether in the mid-19th century. So just going back quickly to my previous graph, you see the mid-19th century is also a time when the national debt is, of course, coming down, but government borrowing is also increasing. And it's also, of course, a massive time when Britain is at the height of its power, imperially, globally, and otherwise. What else does the state do in order to talk about debt? So one of the things that emerges with the modern state is the idea of modern citizenship. And modern citizenship, I would argue, is generated in two ways. One is through taxation, which is essentially a debt paid by citizens to the state, which I've already said sort of underpins the creditworthiness of the state. And the other is a sort of military nationalism, right? So the idea is that not only you sort of pay your taxes to the state, but you must pay in times of war with your service, either military or otherwise, maybe civilian service. But war is another way of generating debts through the citizenry's participation in war, and also through debts to the fallen soldiers. And this fundamentally binds together the nation, which is ultimately a group of people that don't know each other. Yes, they share a flag and a monarch and all the rest of it, but it's really the militarization of nationalism through a language of indebtedness that binds the nation, if you like, psychically together in clear kinds of ways. And finally, of course, the other aspect of the modern state we're all familiar with is the kind of issuing of currency. I'm not going to linger long on this problem other than to note what many have noted, which is that currency is, of course, ultimately a sort of token of debt, as a token of credit. Our banknotes say on them that they are IOUs. I promise to pay the bearer a sum of £10. And the ability to issue currency and to control its supply is central to our understanding of what the modern state does. And what I'm inviting you to do here is to understand the ways in which the control of the tokens of indebtedness then unites with the citizenship questions and the taxation questions and the state borrowing questions to constitute the modern state as a regime in which relations of indebtedness are organized to empower the state and to sort of unite public power with private wealth. Okay, so that's a little run through on the state. I've got more to go, so I'm going to try to speed up a little bit. What about empires? To cut to the chase, the argument that I want to make here is that the modern state in Europe emerges coevally, i.e. at the same time with its imperial and colonial possessions. And a lot of the similar logics that you can see are taking place. So colonial taxes, of course, create forms of indebtedness amongst the colonized. And if you can't pay these off in colonial currencies, you can pay them off in commodities such as cotton or indigo or opium, or you can pay them off through a fixed amount of unpaid labor. And so what you've got in an imperial regime of indebtedness is a system of valuation and accounting that ensures as much value as possible is transferred to the metropole through the creation, if you like, of colonial debts on the part of the colonized. So if you think about British India as a case study, you see that the East India Company wins the right to collect taxes in 1765. And it does so to, and what it does with these taxes in part, apart from paying the soldiers and so on that it uses to govern the space, is to buy the goods from the Indians. So it uses their taxes to buy their own goods and then sell them on at very high prices in Britain and elsewhere around the world. The foreign exchange earnings for these exports remain in London, so they don't get kind of repatriated and reinvested in India. And then the sort of condition of indebtedness that's generated amongst Indians then supplies a labor force which is used globally, particularly after the abolition of slavery. So as an economic system, it's very efficient in terms of how it organizes debt and money. And then finally, I mean, this is more a sort of anecdotal element of it. At the end of the Second World War, there is a lot of reserves in London for the Indian kind of products that have been supplied to the war effort. It's about £2 billion. And as part of the independence negotiations, Britain decides to just kind of keep that and cancel its debts to India at that moment. And that is agreed with the Americans as well as, I guess, the national elite in India. Now, if you use the concept of unequal exchange to try to value the worth of what came out of India during that period, as the economist Utsa Patnaik has done, she's valued the total extraction over this period from the East India companies collecting the taxes to the beginning of the Second World War as a contemporary value of 45 trillion. So that includes, of course, things like compound interest, it's the unpaid labor, it's the undervalued commodities, it's the prices of everything that you might include there. So this is an example, and there are others that you can work through, of an imperial, what I'm calling an imperial debt formation. So an imperial debt formation is an organization of indebtedness, which is fundamentally sort of asymmetric, where you're engaging in taxation, but without representation, where there's much more restricted access to kind of colonial money, meaning you have to pay in kind with your labor or your commodities. And this doesn't necessarily need to coincide with the formal bounds of empire, but it normally did. So what I'm seeing in terms of the emergence of the modern state is that you've got this regime of indebtedness kind of happening in the metropole between the state and the citizens, and that is overlaid with an interlocking with a regime of indebtedness that's happening with the empire, and which is generating its own kind of financial returns. And a lot of those financial returns, of course, then go to capitalize the institutions, the financial institutions in the metropole. Okay, so let's fast forward a little bit. We've looked a bit at what's happened then over the centuries in terms of the national debt in the UK and how that rises and falls. I want to talk a little bit about this idea of the financialization of the world economy. And this is the idea that finance has increasingly come to dominate the world economy in unusual ways. So first, there's a sort of quantitative element. So the increasing weight of the financial versus the non-financial sectors of the economy. So whereas finance used to be a sort of small sector of the economy, the value of financial assets compared to, if you like, non-financial ones is now massively weighted in favor of finance. This has been enabled / caused by the emergence of a supportive institution and regulatory system. There's increasingly liberalized finance and the, if you like, the frontiers of profitability for finance. One of the impacts of this on the sort of the state has been the routing of many basic needs or activities through the financial system. So, of course, we've had the big financialization of higher education in the UK, where in order to sort of participate in higher education, you take out loans and you're engaged in loan repayment over a long period of time. In the US, of course, health is heavily financialized and so on. But financialization also means, if you like, a further level of abstraction from the debt relationship which you might have with, in the past with somebody that you know. It involves the repackaging and reselling of debts on a global market and at a global scale. And we know, of course, the 2008 financial crisis story, which was created in part because the buyers and sellers of these repackaged debts didn't know what they were buying and selling, or had no idea how bad the underlying debts were. And this has come hand in hand with the general deregulation of the credit industry, not just subprime mortgages, but credit cards and credit products. Anything you want to buy now on the internet, you'll also be simultaneously offered a credit product. If you want to buy a car, you'll be simultaneously offered finance and so on. So alongside the real economy for goods and services, you're also being sold finance at the same time. Okay. What does this look like on a global scale? I'm just looking at the debt part of the finance package now. So total global debt, as it stands, is 237% of total GDP, right? So well in excess of what we currently produce at any one time. Now, of course, it doesn't have to match it because it's a future promise, right? The debt value is to be paid over generations. But it's still a historic high in terms of the total amount of debt in the world. And I'm using the categories here from the IMF. The advanced economies, not the US, are at 268% of GDP, US at 273%. So this is total debt. This is public and private, in case you're wondering. I'm going to break those down in a minute. Emerging markets are also becoming increasingly indebted, those outside China, and China itself is taking on a lot of debt as it tries to drive its kind of economic model forward. Even low-income developing countries, normally seen as a very high kind of credit risk for all sorts of reasons, are at a historically high level of debt. So I'll give you a little look in at this table. What I'd like to highlight to you is, if you like, start with the top line, the number at the beginning and the number at the end, so that we can see over the last 7 decades that amount has massively increased, and that's from a high point in the 1950s after World War II, obviously. So global debt regimes, global debt levels have not fallen as you might have expected after a war, as you've seen after other wars, but actually deepened across the board, and especially in what we might call the global north. If we look at this public debt graph, so this is just the debts owed by states, you'll see that at a world level, it's sort of doubled as a percentage of GDP since the 1950s. You see big jumps in the 1970s, of course, partly to do with the oil shock and some of the deregulation going on then. But of course, the other big jump is the 2010s following the global financial crisis and the bailout of the institutions going on there in the recession. But global public debt is at a massive level, and we see now that in the global south, the low-income developing countries who were in a crisis in the 1980s, many of them due to over-indebtedness, are coming up to that level again now as time progresses. Private debt, I won't detain us long on this one, but just to give you the complete picture of how that's gone, that has tripled since the 1950s at a world level. So here you see debt as being something relatively, let's say, unusual for households and companies to take on, to being something much more ubiquitous, much more central to everybody's life strategies, whatever they are. Okay, so what does this mean globally? So obviously economists worry about debt levels and the sustainability of debt levels, particularly for the credibility of repayments. From a political standpoint, I would say that countries, states, and peoples actually have different relationships to the conditions of indebtedness. And some countries at sometimes can use it to expand their reach, their power, and even their production. So if you look at some of the times when Britain's debt was highest historically, it was actually when it was in a period of expansion at the height of its power. The United States has managed to massively increase its debt levels, even during periods of relatively increased power and hegemony. And in the case of the United States, the sort of dollarization of the world economy even means that it's got a relationship with its rivals, such as China and Russia, which involves some codependence, right? So for some people, indebtedness is a empowering thing. For others, it's actually very crippling. If you're indebted in another currency, of course, that's quite volatile, out of your control. You will find it a restriction on democratic decision making about what your policies can be or what kinds of plans you can make, insofar as creditor obligations kind of come first. This may restrict your policy making, and you may ultimately find yourself unsovereign, as many countries in the global south expressed under conditions of heavy debt. So one of the conversations that's going on at the moment, of course, is essentially the UK moving from the first condition to the second condition, and maybe that's something we can talk about in the discussion. Okay, so I'm aware I've only got a few more minutes. I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that in this globally financialized economy, one which is kind of economically unstable, there are various people contesting the current organization of indebtedness. And in the global south, I'd say that this comes through three arguments. The first is about whether some debts are odious, whether they were taken out under illegitimate circumstances, and whether the publics should be on the hook to pay them, as we've discussed. So this is a bunch of Mozambican activists who have been having a case with the High Court about the legitimacy of Mozambique's repayments to a secret loan that was taken out, which I can explain more about. But this, like many others, is essentially on the if the leaders took the loans out illegally and stole the money, then the public should not have to repay them. A second set of questions is about whether former empires should pay reparations to their former sort of imperial subjects, if you like, based on the idea that value was extracted, that wealth was extracted under conditions which were inhumane or illegal, and therefore that there is a sort of reparations obligation there to be had. And that's an argument made strongly, particularly by the Caribbean states, a number of African states as well. And finally, of course, all of the discussion about climate change to some extent has been about climate financing. But if you look at some of the activists, they're calling for climate reparations. Now, the politics of this have become quite interesting because on the one hand, you've had the Loss and Damage Fund established at the COP conferences, which in some respects recognizes that some countries have caused climate change more than others, and others countries are going to bear the brunt of it. But on the other hand, it looks like this funding will increasingly come through loans rather than grants, and will be eventually expected to be repaid, as in the funding for adaptation. So you've got people complaining that actually the cost of climate change is going to be in the trillions and the sort of pledges are in the millions. Okay, so I'll wrap it up now. Well, I just want to say a few things about what the implications are in thinking of in terms of complex indebtedness. So complex indebtedness, I hope I've kind of sketched you a picture of all its different parts. It's happening within state society relations, across, if you like, imperial formations, and then it's sort of relayered in the global economy with financialization and all of these kinds of debt questions. So the first claim I'm making, who owes what to whom and on what terms, is a fundamentally political question. In the modern economy, it is mediated through money and capitalist institutions that organize money. But if we look at what actually happens, then some people's debts are forgiven, some of them are written off, others are not. Some have some interest rates and risk assessments and others have others. I would argue that these are all kind of political questions. Globalization has entailed the complex nesting of regimes of indebtedness within each other, as I've just discussed. And so we need to be attentive to how the threads tie between the systems as well as within them, if you like. Over time, through financialization, we have become more distant socially and economically from our creditors, maybe also politically. And so, if you like, the ancient system of cancelling debts through jubilees and all the rest of it has become a distant idea in an age of largely private creditors and financial institutions. Just to reiterate, indebtedness both enables and restricts certain kinds of political action, but it always redistributes power in some sense, both in taking out debts and contracts, but also in their repayment and enforcement. Two more points that come out of this, I think. So the first, which I think I want to hammer home, that credit is not only an economic facility, but under the right conditions, a public good. And in doing all of this work on debt and in reading this stuff, I've come to understand the sort of right to fair credit as one of those basic needs in the kind of modern society that we have. And I think that's been recognized by a lot of people, particularly working in low income sectors or working with people from low incomes, that there is a greatly exploitative potential to systems of indebtedness that are completely unregulated, and therefore access to credit has a sort of public good element. And then finally, a sort of general point that I hope you would take from this is that the contemporary crisis of indebtedness needs to be resolved politically and not only by economists. I'm sure we'll have some conversations about Rachel Reeves's fiscal rules, but in a way, as many people are now saying, the fiscal rules are a political box that is constructed by the sort of political establishment themselves, and so the parameters of that box and the what it means to do that rather than something else is something that we should have a conversation about in order to be a democracy. Okay, that is the end of my talk. I hope I have not pushed too much into it, and I look forward to your questions. David, may I stop sharing my screen now?
Yes, that's absolutely fine. Thank you very much, Mira. Really found it very interesting, and I'm sure we'll have some wonderful questions to go through and discuss now as we move into the Q&A session. If you do have any questions, please feel free to put them through, and I'll pass those on to Mira. I'll start with just one of the ones that you mentioned before. You talked about the first and second condition, like the UK potentially moving into the second. I wondered if you just elaborate a little bit on that before we go on.
Yes, so I mean, it's a sort of rhetorical thing that people say from time to time, oh, this is becoming a third world country and all the rest of it. And what that used to mean concretely, economically, was that wealth was concentrated in the hands of a small number of people, that they were externally dependent on international financial links and systems more so than they were accountable downwards, that assets were owned by foreign investors for the most part, and that I suppose, markets could effectively punish perceived overspending by the government. Now, this is all stuff that is happening in the UK today. If we think about who owns major industries, if we think about the vulnerability of the pound to the sort of views of markets on spending and so on. And so there's a and the concentration of wealth and ownership increasingly outside of the UK. So what used to be a more broad-based economy in terms of ownership has now become more narrowly focused, I think.
Cool, thank you. Yes, we do have one question here from the audience, and they've asked, who is the UK government debt owed? Yeah, sorry, so who is the UK government debt owed, and how much is actually owed to the UK government itself? So it really isn't the debt they're going to sell.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, in the UK government will own some of its own debt in the sense that the portfolios of some departments of central government will include holding of UK bonds. The pension funds of a lot of UK government kind of institutions will also hold UK bonds. And so in that sense, some of it is owed to itself, and is somewhere on the balance sheet as both asset and liability if we take the government as a whole. I'm not 100% sure about the accounting of that and whether you could just sort of strike those off and write them off against each other. So yeah, looking at debts without looking at liabilities is always also a bit of a problematic exercise.
Thank you. And I've just got on there as well. That table that you showed of the levels of debt over time, I found that quite stark, to be honest. I hadn't realised the extent to which you portrayed there. I just wondered if you could talk about whether there are any different implications, I guess, society or economically, in kind of that aspect of public debt rising versus private debt, for instance, or versus personal debt. Are there any different implications that we might see based on those different three levels?
Yes, I mean it's complicated. So public debt rising. So on the one hand, you can see it as a post-imperial feature of the global north in which, okay, you don't have the offsetting kind of revenue from the colonies anymore after the 1960s, especially. And so your receipts are sort of going down, and or maybe you have to pay more for goods than you used to because those countries are now charging more of them and then they're in their own currencies and whatnot. And so some of that is going down, and also then your power vis-a-vis the United States is also weaker. So that's costing you more to the extent that you're dependent on those imports. But you also do not want to necessarily create a lower standard of living amongst your public. And so you've got a strong currency, you can borrow credibly to a certain extent, and quite well. And actually, Britain, that's a gamble that sort of paid off for Britain insofar as the borrowing costs and the level of debt went down a lot in the 90s. Now, part of this is because finance became deregulated, and so interest rates themselves kind of collapsed. But one crude way of telling the story is that um, colonial revenues were not offset with sort of increased productivity or real economic value being added. And so financialization allows governments and to a certain extent economies to offset that problem by deferring it through indebtedness, right? And so instead of you sort of earning intensively, you're sort of just stretching out your repayments, and you stop, but your control over the economic system is not what it used to be, I suppose.
I just kind of linked in with that. I wondered if you knew of kind of, or could give any examples of any distinct differences in the manner in which uh, former empires embedded that indebtedness into their colonies.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, so France is an interesting example. The CFA franc obviously is a currency that's still in use by 14 former French colonies. And part of the requirement of using that is that a certain amount of those national reserves are held in France, and contribute to the French kind of asset base as well. So that's kind of a clear example. They have the advantage of it being kind of pegged to the euro, but many have argued that it remains overall a kind of drain on the economies in which it's kind of operational. And there's been a lot of kind of political conversation about the complicity of various ruling elites with the French kind of state in order to maintain their power. The French government supports them, and in return, it gets kind of cooperation with its financial system.
Another question from the audience here. Fabulous talk, they say. Yeah. What role do you see or would you like to see global institutions playing in this? Is their first one.
Yeah.
And what is the evolution or an end game in your mind? What would make you give a talk on the simplicity, not the complexity of debt?
It's a very big question. Thank you. Um, what is the end game? I think it's so on one level, it's tempting to give a historical example. At some point, when debts are unpayable, they will just be repudiated in some respect. And several countries, of course, have defaulted individually on their debts. And in this geopolitical moment where there is more competition, if you like, for partnership, that will in general lead to softer lending conditions than harder ones because people are competing to lend, if you like. What I would like to see is, I suppose, a serious conversation about the public value of different actions. I mean, climate change is a very good example. So it's very obvious that there needs to be coordinated action slash investment in carbon absorbing technologies or mitigations of various kinds. But the global financial system says, okay, well, these countries can't afford to borrow, those countries, like, but this is putting the cart before the horse. I know, so I don't agree with modern monetary theory about a lot of things, but about this thing about putting the cart before the horse, I think is correct. That what you need is to organize the technologies in the economy in such ways to enable that adaptation rather than use the supply of money or the availability of credit as a reason not to do it. Yeah, I think that would be a simple way to think about debt and use debt to enable public goods.
Another one here, you mentioned growing work on theology of debt. In a world where religious leaders increasingly have a lot of influence within governments, they give the examples of the States, Russia,
Yeah.
Israel, a lot of African countries. Do you see this theology of debt influencing systems of indebtedness?
So this is a really interesting question because in the current system, most of those regimes have been the most pro-capitalist, if you like. There's a real convergence between, if you like, the sort of plutocrat regime around Trump in terms of the tech bros wanting massive financial deregulation and the sort of religious right. I would say that, but there is also if you like, there's a top-down Christianity at work, let's say, to take Christianity as an example, and there's also bottom-up Christianity at work. So on the one hand, the Church of England is one of the kind of leading ethical investors. It doesn't invest in gambling, pornography, but also usury, right? So it's kept its usury prescription and doesn't invest in payday loan companies, for example. It has a very big asset base to invest because of all of the land and property it's acquired over the years. But they're also at the forefront of many of these campaigns. So if you look at Christian Aid or Action Aid or these sort of NGOs campaigning for debt relief, some are doing so from a theological standpoint. So if you like, we've got religion on both sides of the argument in that respect. But I don't think that we live in a world where rulers will be moved by religious values on debt forgiveness. They're more likely to be moved, to talk religiously about, pro-life kind of agendas or so on.
Do you have any examples or anything you've seen with regards to global advocacy and activism? Anything that is kind of leveraging these ideas to kind of produce some tangible outcomes around the issue?
I mean, so obviously the high point for the global debt movement was in the 2000s with the big debt cancellation package under Blair and Brown, sort of pushed a lot by Gordon Brown, who himself actually is kind of open about the Christian underpinnings of a lot of his thinking about the economy as well. But so there was a big debt cancellation package, the Jubilee 2000 campaign. That was the last time there was a significant cancellation. Some of those organizations have lingered on. And to be honest, they're generating more now. If you look at all of the unrest that's going on in the global south, you had protests in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, in Kenya. A lot of these riots are driven through essentially the diminishing living conditions that states under austerity have had to do. So states that are over indebted then suddenly have to either cut fuel subsidies or food subsidies or fire people in the public services. And these are the people now going out on the streets, turning over the regimes, and it's going on, and you'll see it all over the place. And so in that sense, there's clearly political demand to rethink or renegotiate the debt. What's different this time around, particularly this time around, is a lot of that debt is now owed to commercial lenders rather than bilaterally. And so to put it crudely, it's the sort of equivalent of payday loans for the global south, the deregulation, the search for an emerging frontier, high interest, and all the rest of it.
I think we've got a comment here that says the overseas sterling balances were a significant issue for the UK up to as recently as the late 1970s.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I'll follow that up. So this is all kind of going to be part of hopefully a book I'm writing on this idea of complex indebtedness, trying to help us, I suppose, to think through some of the issues in the way I've said today.
I look forward to reading it. I wonder, looking at everything that's happening in geopolitics now with Russia and the United States, for instance, and the influence of China within that, how do you think kind of emerging global dynamics might accelerate or kind of dismantle the kind of current hierarchy of indebtedness, really, I guess?
It's a good question. I mean, a lot depends on where China decides to place its bets. So at the moment it's kind of hedging its bets in the sense that it's fully participating in the global financial system as it is, but it's also side building a number of alternative institutions in inverted commas that currently are not very kind of quantitatively significant compared to the globalized financial system, but which I would expect to grow in importance over the coming decades. Part of it will depend on whether there is any attempt to put together a sort of basket currency or alternative to the US dollar. If that happens, then yes, and that could significantly shift the balance of power because the management of the exchange rate and all of that would be much tighter. I would expect it to be much tighter. However, there's also evidence of China trying out some other sort of tactics in terms of re-dollarization and uh, using the dollar to sort of offset some of its own costs, if you like. So I think it's a wait and see question.
And kind of linked in with that, I guess. So looking at things like the BRICS New Development Bank and the China's Belt and Road Initiative, do you think that those can be a genuine challenge to the existing kind of debt formations, if you like? And are they useful in that?
Mm. I mean, so they remain hierarchical and asymmetric in terms of how they work. And obviously, so Sri Lanka's just seen what happens if you don't pay. It's not that China, I don't think China is more aggressive in pursuing repayment than other lenders. It's not. It's restructured some of the debt and it's done some of the other things. Um, but yes, you'll still lose your port if that happens. And so so it's not total charity either. Um, But I think the question is going to be how strong the commercial lenders go in. So one of the first things that happened when Sri Lanka defaulted was that, a sort of bank in a tax haven showed up immediately, kind of demanding repayment and taking them to court. And this was like straight away. And so you've got investors which are not sort of diplomatically concerned about managing relations. They just will want their money back.
Um, okay, so here, do you have a view on the desirability of transferring the Russian reserve assets to Ukraine?
So I certainly think that, you can make a moral case for it. So, well, I'll say two things. So, one, the reorganization of debts through war is very normal. So, what you've got at the Versailles Conference after World War One, and we've got all of these peace conferences. Peace conferences are basically about reorganizing the debt from the losers to the winners, as in always in putting more debts on the losers in order to do the winners. And so, in a way, the seizure of the Russian assets or the giving them to Ukraine or whatever is in a way attempting to strike a peace deal or unilaterally strike out a defeat deal before it's happened. So it may be politically unwise, but you could certainly make a moral case that the loss and damage to Ukraine should be repaid by Russia regardless. But normally those questions are settled by force in war. And yes, there's probably a legal liability involved if it's not underpinned by some kind of peace treaty. But I don't have a moral problem with it.
Fair enough. And we've got another comment here. The putative Mar-a-Lago Accord suggests a recalibration of existing US debt on more favorable terms to the US in return for protection, which fits your framework of analysis.
Thank you again. I think that's just a very helpful comment, and I'll follow that up. I mean, the thing is with this project, I love it, but it's wrestling a bear because there's so many threads and things to follow up all the time, and
Yeah.
then you learn things about whose debt got cancelled and under what conditions, and things which seem to be very, very robust things. So, a lot of Germany's debt was cancelled after World War II, in part because people didn't want a repeat of indebted Germany thrashing around in the middle of Europe. Um, and the Greeks pointed this out when they were in debt during their sovereign debt crisis. But, at that time, Greek sovereign debt was seen as this big problem, this big political thing. And so everything had to be done to make Greece repay. But under different conditions, maybe it would have been, so it's entirely possible to write off this debt. I mean, people write off debts all the time. The state guarantees all kinds of industries, um,
Mhm.
utilities, let's see, Thames Water, and all the rest of it. So things that it decides are politically important for it can underwrite the debts too, and it's no biggie, right? I mean, it's a biggie for us who have to kind of put the bill, but politically it can be done.
Thank you. And yeah, if there aren't any more questions, I guess this will probably be the last one. Just thinking about the research that you'll be doing from here, especially writing your upcoming book, what what lines of questioning or what lines of research do you hope to kind of explore to further delve into these ideas?
It's a great question. I mean, part of the reason I started writing this or started working on this project is because I wanted to answer the question of whether, I mean, if you like, whether the South-South debt cooperation was better or worse or the same as the sort of old type. And I think the framework of complex indebtedness is helping me understand both the similarities and the differences between these kinds of lending and also giving me a sort of historical view of sort of rise and fall of indebtedness. But it's also an attempt to make sense of, I suppose I'm making political sense of things like a call for climate reparations. So one way you can understand the project is how can you understand the world in a way that makes that language make sense. And you can understand it if you think about the organization of indebtedness, the political sort of management of that, and the way in which the economy is developed over time, such that, of course, it's going to be very heavily resisted for all kinds of reasons, but at least as a position, as a starting position, it's not unintelligible.
Mhm. Okay, well, thank you. It's a nice note to end on. Thank you very much. Um, yes, before we wrap up, just a really big thank you, Dr. Meera Sabaratnam, for your time this evening, for going through that and for that interesting discussion at the end as well. I really appreciate you taking the time to prepare everything and deliver everything as well. Thank you.
Thank you very
Um,
much, David. I've really appreciated it and to all of your great questions and contributions.
no problem at all. A big thank you to everybody else for joining us tonight as well, and thank you for your participation and your questions. We will be releasing information about our next event very shortly, so please do keep an eye on the website and subscribe to the newsletter for any further updates. But other than that, we look forward to seeing you at some more ELC events in the future. Once again, Mira, very big thank you for this evening. We appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone.